Good day, investors. Welcome to Vested with Jared Bowers. I have a question for you. If you are going to play the comparison game in an unhealthy way, which we all do from time to time, are you of the personality type that typically compares up or compares down? Here's what I mean. Comparing up is seeing yourself as inferior, behind, underprivileged, oppressed, worse. Others are doing better and you aren't. Victimhood would be a broad term that might apply here. Comparing down is seeing yourself as superior, ahead. You are doing better than others. Prideful would be the broad term to apply here. Growing up, my wife and I had quite extreme examples of both of these in our own families. Often, these comparison game bents can and do become the lenses through which we see the world and judge ourselves and others. And if we practice looking through those lenses for long enough, they can become fused to our eye sockets. They can become hard to remove or change. But there are also healthy ways to play the comparison game. And that is what we are going to dive into today. Last time, we talked about tracking and measuring, the first two important steps in the overall process of benchmarking. And now, benchmarking, the final step, is what we are here to talk about today. If you missed the last episode, I think it would be helpful to go back and listen to it. But as is our theme and our goal, not entirely necessary. This discussion about benchmarking should stand well on its own. But a very quick rehash of what we talked about last time is going to help either way. And of course, as is also our theme, what we talk about is for the purpose of not just money investing, but more importantly, all the areas of life that go beyond money. We want to be using these tools in ways that help us manage all of our investment portfolios of life better. Okay, let me get us on the same page fast. Our last episode topic was tracking and measuring. Tracking is the first step in the benchmarking process. Tracking means paying attention and recording those observations. That can be pen and paper, it can be an app, it can be a spreadsheet, phone notes. But we have a tendency to forget or to skew reality without the actual tracking part. And that brings us to measuring. And here it's more about doing it right. Because we all measure. We often just have inaccurate ways of applying measuring tools, or we use inaccurate measuring tools in the first place. But we want to apply objective and accurate tools for the most accurate measurements. But why? Why do we do these things? Well, we talked last time that what we pay attention to, what we actually track and measure, grows in importance. The caveat is that we have to be careful about what we apply that level of attention to, because ultimately we are tracking and measuring for a reason. And that brings us to benchmarking. With benchmarking, we are deciding what the data we've tracked and measured means, and then what we are going to actually do with it. There's an overarching question when it comes to benchmarking. Compared to what? And we're going to keep calling back to that question. But wait, comparison is bad, right? I know, I did that in the last episode. You can't be tricked twice. But we can't get around the fact that comparison has such a bad reputation. And for good reason. Comparison in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons should have a bad reputation. And we are going to be focusing this entire episode and plenty more times in the future on comparison. But there's a big difference between the comparison games that we play for the wrong reasons and the benchmarking that we do for the right reasons. Wrong reasons to compare include pride, making ourselves feel better, elevating ourselves above other people, or in a different but related application of comparison, putting other people down. Some of us use comparison even to put ourselves down. That's self-castigation, masochism. Some of us like to beat ourselves up and look for examples of how we are failing. Another common application of comparison, or a common reason that we compare, is jealousy disguised as fairness. Remember what we mentioned last time about looking in someone else's bowl. The only time we should look in someone else's bowl is to make sure the other person has enough. But that is easily disguised, even to ourselves, as we're just making sure that things are fair. But we know the difference. Because in those cases, we are going to be fine. And we're not going to say anything, probably, if we find out that we have more in our bowl than the other person does. We're only going to say something if we find out that we have less. That is not fairness. No one who complained about their low salary at the start of their career as a problem of fairness offers to get paid less in the future when they recognize that the current underlings work harder than they do, but get paid less. Those are all bad applications of comparison. And those represent how comparison is mostly applied. A lot of what we call fairness is just jealousy with better branding. Comparison, when it comes to benchmarking done right, however, is a powerful tool that is very different than the comparison games that we like to play inside our heads or with other people. That's because benchmarking is comparing what we have tracked and measured accurately, objectively, maybe obsessively, to a standard, for the purpose of identifying what, if anything, needs adjustment, which is asset allocation. We talked about that just recently, didn't we? Again, it's our callback question for this episode. Compared to what? But also, for what purpose? And there is another of our favorite recurring questions. Hey, look, we've been around long enough to have some recurring questions. Nice. And those two questions, compared to what and for what purpose, is what sets the intentional process of benchmarking apart from comparison games. Ask those two questions, and most bad comparisons fall apart. This is what turns comparison into benchmarking, and how we use comparison for the right reasons and the right outcomes. Let's talk, at least briefly, through some of the areas of life where benchmarking is commonly applied for positive purposes toward productive ends. One of the most common places we come across this is in medicine. When it comes to our health, if you go in and get tested for something, at your annual health screening, getting routine blood work maybe, or for a specific problem, they will typically run a bunch of tests. And these are to look for what's going on inside your body. And also to do a few measures of what's going on outside of your body. Listen to things, observe things. That is the process of measuring. And you better believe that they're going to be tracking it as well. It is written down and it is recorded for future reference. The tracking and the measuring process is very well established here. But then there is a final step that turns the data that was just gathered into useful and actionable information. Numbers without benchmarks are just numbers. Just having numbers for your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your body weight, your liver enzymes, whatever the heck those are, is not very useful without comparison, benchmarks. Because how do you know if your measurements are good or not? The answer is benchmarks. Oftentimes, they'll have benchmarks printed out on the sheet that they give you with your numbers on them. And those will show you, are you in range or are you out of range? The accurate tracking and measuring is really important, but it is effectively meaningless without the benchmarks. A number by itself doesn't tell us much. The reference points give us the context we need to turn our numbers into useful and actionable information. Those benchmarks at the doctor are ideally based on healthy population data. To go on a bit of a rabbit trail here, unfortunately, most of the time, these medical benchmarks are based on population data, or at least they skew in that direction. This means that you might have an average number that makes you think it's good, but since you're comparing to a population mean that tends to be not as healthy as they should be, it might result in you believing that you are healthier than you actually are. And that is a downside of an improper benchmark. Ideally, these benchmarks would be based on healthy measures. Next, let's talk about benchmarks as they are often applied in sports. Think of the very popular NFL Combine. How fast these guys can run a 40-yard dash. how many times they can bench press a specific weight, how high they can jump. They are tracking and measuring those like crazy. And most importantly, they are comparing them to benchmarks, to standards. And we have a lot of application of benchmarking when it comes to money in the world of personal finance. I'm looking forward to digging into some of these rules of thumb in the future. After you've tracked and measured and know these numbers, then there are benchmarks that you can apply to them. Here are a few quick examples. How many multiples of your annual income you've saved and invested by a given age can tell you whether you're on track in terms of retirement savings. Your net worth versus the number of years worked and income level will tell you whether you're doing a good job of building wealth with that given level of income, or whether you're probably overspending, underinvesting. The percentage of income you spend on different budget categories is another example, like housing, cars, entertainment. That can very quickly signal whether you are managing your finances well or poorly. A healthy range for your percentage of income spent on housing, for example, would be between 20 and 25% of your total salary. Below 20% is excellent, above 30% becomes concerning, and above 40% is a big warning sign. Those are each important benchmarks. Again, in future episodes, we'll dive into each of these specifically, and many more. And one of the most common places that we can apply benchmarking is in financial investing. I manage portfolios of stocks and bonds for wealthy families across the country, as you probably know by now. These are high to ultra high net worth individuals and couples who have hired me and my company to manage their investment assets. We also provide comprehensive financial planning, help them with basically everything that has to do with money. My portfolio and my clients' portfolios are made up of the same 40-ish high-quality companies on the company ownership side of their holdings. For any clients who are more conservative or need more stability in their portfolio, we also invest in individual bonds and some bond funds on the fixed income side, on the debt side. Because remember, there are only two ways fundamentally that you can invest: debt and equity. Part of my job is to track and measure returns, as we talked about in a previous episode. Calculating those returns is pretty straightforward. And it's not just the magnitude of returns that are important. Be it 5%, 10%, 20%. We also need to know how are our returns when compared to a standard, compared to a benchmark. A crucial step after calculating our returns is then comparing these returns to an objective and appropriate benchmark. Determining the proper benchmark is really important. It's great to have returns of 15% in a year, but it doesn't mean much until I answer the question, compared to what? The overall benchmark for our portfolios contain a number of indexes to accurately compare returns of our portfolios. First, the index of large publicly traded companies. That's the S&P 500, which represents most of the value of public companies traded in the US. Next is the small company index, which is the S&P 600, the medium-sized company index, the S&P 400. We have some international companies that are represented in the benchmark by the MSCI EFA index. We have a small piece of an emerging market index. We have one or more bond indices depending on how our clients are invested. And finally, in most cases, we include a cash index because most of my clients need us to hold a certain percentage of their portfolio in cash that they can use, but they still want to get returns on it. Those are the primary indices that comprise our custom benchmark. When I compare our returns to this custom benchmark, I can ask myself, am I actually doing well compared to an objective standard? And it's not just any one of those. It's a blend of all of those, because the portfolio is a blend of all of those categories. And this is crucial because I, or any portfolio manager, can be winning even if they're going in a negative direction. Or we can be losing even if we're going in a positive direction. Let me explain. Consider a case where the portfolio that I manage is down 20% in a year. That's bad, right? Well, not necessarily. We don't like things going down in value. I'm not crazy. But what if the benchmark that portfolio is compared against, the appropriate objective benchmark, was down 40% over that year? then in that case, a 20% down year is pretty dang good. You might think that it would have been better to have been sold out before that drop and captured a zero return, and you'd technically be right. But applying a sell out when it's high strategy is a solidly losing strategy over time, which is why we stay invested. More on that another time. And on the flip side, let's look at the example in the other direction. If my portfolio is up 15% in a year, okay, pretty darn good, right? But it becomes not so good when the benchmark is up 20%. Hello 2025 for our portfolio. Slightly different numbers, but 2025 happened to be the first year ever that I and my company were behind the benchmarks in an up year. A weird position to be in for us. It will happen. The only other years where we've been behind the benchmarks is in down years. And side note, if you have an investment manager that only ever reports market-beating returns year after year, be skeptical. In those cases, they are either moving the goalposts, changing the benchmarks, or engaging in shenanigans of some sort. We will have fun dissecting questions to ask your portfolio manager in an upcoming episode. But these are examples to illustrate benchmarks in action, and are two very important questions. Compared to what, and for what purpose? And the standard that we set, the benchmark that we choose, is crucial, because the wrong benchmark can throw everything off. The wrong benchmark can be demotivating, or make us feel like quitting if it's set too high, or too stringently, or too difficult to achieve. But, in the other direction, a bad benchmark also can make poor returns look good by contrast. Let's talk through some other bad benchmarks. If the bar is set too low, that can result in, hey look, I'm healthier than most people my age. Except if most people your age are unhealthy. So then that makes that not a good benchmark. Or how about, well, I eat better than I used to, but that implies how you used to eat was already pretty bad. So using that as a benchmark may not give you very good results. Or, how about an example in my world? Global equities were up 3% and we were up 8%, handily beating the benchmark. Except, as a US focused portfolio, global equities are probably not the right benchmark to solely use. We talked last time about relationships and the tracking and measuring that we can apply to those. The standard of we never have conflict or we never fight may not actually be a good benchmark, right? The benchmark of how much an item costs as a measure of quality can be an okay benchmark in some cases, but oftentimes is inaccurate. We think if it costs more money, it must be higher quality. It must be better. Not necessarily. So that being used as a benchmark can get us bad results. It will not actually tell you about the value that you're getting. But we use it as a benchmark all the time. Something like shoes may be a better product to apply that benchmark to. Higher price often means better materials, better construction. But something like a t-shirt, the exact same t-shirt, just with a different brand label attached to it, can double or triple or quadruple or more the price, and that does not mean that it's any better quality. How about job titles as a benchmark of experience or skill or progress? That can be right in some cases, but it's often not a very good benchmark to use. Job title by itself doesn't tell you very much. Hours worked is not a very good benchmark for productivity or results delivered. Busyness is very much related to that. How busy we are as a measure of how important we are or how much we're getting done is a very poor benchmark to measure against. And back to dollars again. How about the amount of money saved? Seems like a pretty objective benchmark. But the amount of dollars saved without other context is not a very good benchmark because $1,000 saved might be very impressive and quite an achievement, or it might not be. If you make $250,000 and you have $100,000 in the bank, after a decade of working, I'm not impressed. But if you make $50,000 a year and you're early in your career and you have $25,000 in the bank, okay, that might be an impressive achievement. Now, let's get most of that money out of the bank and into equity ownership. Let's make sure that it's invested, right? Okay, speaking of bad benchmarks and the way that benchmarks are applied inappropriately, The type of bad benchmark I want to focus on now is the anti-benchmark. We've talked previously about how you should not invest toward not something, and that is a very bad investment strategy. Stating that not as a double negative, we should be investing toward something. Positive direction versus negative direction. We cannot build something around a void. That is a very familiar and a very common trap. Anytime we have an anti-benchmark, that simply just identifies an area on the map that we don't want to be. But that gives us nothing to actually invest toward. And by way of example, how many times have you heard someone say, or maybe you yourself have said, I will never be anything like my mother, or I just don't want to be anything like my dad? Well, the most common result that I see from this anti-benchmark approach is that those people who set that as their goal, as their benchmark, just become a different version of that parent. Often they may become a worse version because all they did was identify a single point on the map where they don't want to be. And they nailed it because they aren't standing in that exact spot. They might just be standing on a worse, slightly adjacent spot, but they aren't standing on that exact spot that they were shooting not for. And they've identified that as success. I'm not exactly as that person is, therefore I'm good. But we know in those cases, that's probably not good. Not my dad is not a useful life strategy. And that's what I mean by having an anti-benchmark. A place or an outcome that you are shooting not for, rather than something or some place that you are shooting for. You should choose a specific place or at least an area on the map that gives you a real target, and then take the steps to achieve it. You know where you're pointing, and you have the objective data from your tracking and measuring to apply. The anti-benchmark, the investing in a way that is toward not something rather than toward something, is the polar magnet example that we've talked about before. The magnet turned to repel doesn't get you to a place you want to be on the map. It just spins you out and away from the spot you don't want to be. Remember the poor mindset versus the wealthy mindset episodes. One of the biggest markers of someone with a poor mindset is that they are motivated by what they don't want, compared to the wealthy mindset that is motivated by what they do want. What we want is to have a proper benchmark appropriately applied. Compared to what? And for what purpose? Once you have that, you have your direction. And this is a key point. If you take nothing else away from this episode, please hear and consider this. 2 points on a map will create a line between where you are at right now and where you want to be. Without either of those 2 points, your line doesn't exist. Or with inaccurate points, your line is worthless. It doesn't mean anything. With 2 accurate points, where you are, which is revealed by your tracking and measuring, and where you are pointing toward, which is your objective benchmark, you have a line that is incredibly valuable. That line is your trajectory. And our trajectory and our direction matters so much more than where we are at right now. And our trajectory and our direction leads us to our goal, even if that seems to be far from where we're at right now. That is true whether you are at a low point, pointing towards a high point, or whether you are at a high point, pointing towards a low point. The low point only sucks if you continue to stay there or go lower. And the high point is only great if you stay there or go higher. Trajectory is king. Trajectory is what actually matters. And those 2 points on our map between where we are and what we are shooting for, and taking steps to achieve, is our trajectory. I'll say it again just to make sure it is as clear as it can be. The point we are at right now, as revealed by our accurate and diligent tracking and measuring, and the point we are shooting for as determined by our appropriate target and our purpose, our benchmark, creates the line that is our trajectory. Anti-benchmarks are scarcity and poor mindset driven. Appropriate benchmarks are abundance and wealthy mindset driven. And this is why our question of for what purpose comes in, as it does with many of our topics. The bad reasons to benchmark just to state those plainly and clearly, even though we've touched on them already, are to feel superior to other people, or to feel better about our own poor results, or for self-punishment, masochistic motivations, liking the feeling of feeling bad, or maybe to downplay our own success, which can happen if you pick an unattainable benchmark. Good and proper and appropriate reasons for benchmarking are things like for the purpose of learning, for the purpose of making appropriate adjustments to get us to an achievable point or direction that we are targeting, for the purpose of identifying what is possible, for the purpose of gaining motivation by seeing our progress over time, for the purpose of determining whether you're actually getting the results that you're shooting for. Benchmarking, applied appropriately, answers the question, are you the person you claim to be? Are you becoming the person you want to be? Are you getting the results? And are you on a path to getting the results you say you want? Using the tools and measurements of benchmarking versus playing comparison games may seem similar at first glance, but it is how they are applied that determines whether we are playing an unhealthy comparison game or whether we are appropriately benchmarking. The same tools that can help you are also the same tools that can break you, depending on how they are applied and for what purpose. And for these reasons and many more, we need to choose appropriate benchmarks. Speaking of tools and measurements, let's talk about some benchmarks that we can use. We've talked already about objective standards. A specific dollar amount is a good example. Let's say you're targeting that for retirement or being debt-free. That is a specific objective standard. Another good benchmark might be a specific position or responsibility within your company. An objective standard can be something that is binary. I'm not this right now, I want to be this in the future. That might be employed, married, a parent, all good things. We have objective goals and standards applied when it comes to physical pursuits that we do. In fitness, that would be things like mile time, deadlift weight, miles walked, number of pull-ups. Other benchmarks that we can use are our peers, the people that we're around. Again, be careful. Do it for the right reasons, but those people around you can often be useful benchmarks. We need to be careful about comparison games, but if you're on a team, benchmarking yourself against your teammates will tell you what you need to work on. It will tell you whether you are a net contributor or not. That's true when it comes to sports. That's true when it comes to the businesses that we work in, the organizations that we volunteer in. Don't set your peer group standard based on a low benchmark just to make yourself feel better. Look for how you are actually contributing versus other contributors in your group. Another benchmark that we can apply or can use are people or outcomes that are best in class. Those can be people at the top of their field, teams or organizations that set the standard for their industry, investment funds that are best in class and have been for a long time. But one benchmark that I want to call specific attention to is probably our best benchmark in most things, and that is ourselves. Often, the best benchmark that we can use is ourself yesterday or last month or last year. Because we can ask ourselves the very simple question, am I making progress? Am I moving forward? Am I getting better? The good news is that this is very possible and applicable when you have accurate data that you are tracking and measuring. And if you're going to play the comparison game, the safest and probably most appropriate person to play that comparison game with is yourself. Because if you're falling below a standard, you know what's achievable to get back to it. If you're well above a standard, you're not setting yourself on a pedestal looking down on some other person. You're observing your own progress. And I want to make clear that our benchmarks do not need to stay the same forever. The benchmarks that I have in my portfolio do stay the same, year to year, and I expect that to continue. They may adjust based on the proportion of the portfolio that I have in big companies versus small companies, but those benchmarks are going to stay the same. They're not going to change. But the benchmarks that we use in other areas can and should and will change over time when it's appropriate. For instance, a big pursuit of mine is on the bike. Road biking, mountain biking. I've talked before about how much I love it. And for the past more than 10 years, I've been chasing faster and faster times on the bike in various ways, on different routes, on the road, on the single track. And that has provided me with very motivating and objective goals to continue pushing myself, to get better and faster. I've enjoyed it a lot. I've been able to get to times that even 5, 6, 7 years ago, I did not think were possible for myself. And the benchmark has been myself. But I will not hold those numbers as my benchmark forever. I won't be able to keep using my past self as my benchmark forever, because at some point, I will not be able to continue getting my own times down. I probably don't have very many years left of setting new PRs. I think I do have many years left of holding a very high level of fitness and keeping my standards very high. But years ago, I was dropping my times by minutes. Now, anytime I hit a new personal best, I'm dropping those times by seconds. And instead of weeks in between, it's months or even years in between setting those marks. The benchmark that I use to determine the success that I have on the bike is going to change. And I have never compared my times to the professionals, because as much progress as I've made and as happy as I am with my results, if I compared it even just to regional pros, I would be pretty disappointed with what I can do and what I've achieved. But the important thing here is that I have been my own benchmark for most of that time, and my benchmark will probably change. I expect that 38-year-old me, who has set personal bests in nearly every one of those categories, is going to be a very bad benchmark for 48-year-old me. There's a chance I'm wrong. I'd be happy to be wrong. But it certainly won't be for 58-year-old me. The same is true in other areas of life. I've passed many of the dollar benchmarks that I set when I was much younger, and I've needed to update those benchmarks. Sometimes we blow past a goal or exceed the benchmarks that just don't apply anymore. And we need to reevaluate. Okay, what do we need to redirect our efforts to? Or how do we need to raise the bar? And along those lines, we need to be careful about some of the pitfalls of benchmarking, even outside of the comparison games that we play with other people. And specifically, the most common pitfall that I see is, I'll be happy when. I've seen it play out in a lot of the people around me. I identify it easily because I have played those games myself many, many times before. I've been pretty darn good at playing that game. I'll be happy when I make this much money. I'll be happy when I get this house. I'll be happy when I no longer have to deal with this. I'll be happy when I retire. I'll be happy when my spouse stops doing this or starts doing that. I'll be happy when I'm done with school. I'll be happy when I get the job. And sometimes that is the case. But oftentimes it just represents a pattern and a mindset. I have a friend, and I'm not sure that I can consider him a friend much anymore because we aren't in contact. But going all the way back to our high school days, this friend was always very discontent. But he always knew exactly what he needed that was going to make him happy. And he talked about it all the time. And once he got that thing, he was going to be happy. And he got a lot of those things, and he was never happy. Because it just changed to the next thing. It turns out it wasn't any of those things that was going to make him happy. And from what I hear, he hasn't found his happiness yet. But he still believes that when this next thing happens, he will be happy. And that is a pitfall of using benchmarks in the wrong direction. We can convince ourselves that we are dissatisfied and unhappy because we have not achieved this. We've not yet done that. We don't have something yet. But that is a sad and discontented way to live. We know this. And I'm guilty of it myself in many ways. I have accomplished everything I said would make me happy when I was in my 20s. And I still struggle with contentment. We need to be careful what we tell ourselves when it comes to benchmarks. It needs to make sense. It needs to be achievable. It needs to be for a purpose. And we have to be careful not to lie to ourselves that achieving a goal or exceeding a benchmark will fill a void in our soul that has nothing to do with that. Let's talk about another pitfall of benchmarking. Setting the bar too high. This can be demotivating and can make even a very successful person feel like a failure. The example of Warren Buffett comes to mind. There are very few portfolio managers that will feel like a success if they use Warren Buffett's returns as their objective benchmark. Now, to be honest with you, I do use Buffett as a target, as an aspirational target, and as a benchmark. But I try to use that less from a raw magnitude of returns benchmark standpoint and more from a process and approach benchmark standpoint. Because to call back to our lagging versus leading indicators discussion from the last episode, Buffett's lagging indicator is his returns. His leading indicator is his approach to investing. His focus was on finding and holding on to high return on equity companies with strong balance sheets, phenomenal management in industries and businesses that he could understand. And he maniacally focused on those as his leading indicators. And that is how he achieved his returns, which were the result of what was actually important, the fundamentals. And I work hard to do the same thing in my own portfolio, to focus on the leading indicators that result in the returns that we want, which is the lagging indicator. Appropriate benchmarking requires what I call a professional grade mindset. It requires ownership, accountability, proper incentives. I would encourage you to get comfortable with and seek out ways of being measured to an objective standard, and then do what you can to be rewarded based on that standard. Most people want to and are happy with hiding in the crowd. But with my job as a portfolio manager, I am not able to hide from my results, nor should I be able to. I am measured to the basis point. You can determine how well I have done, and you can measure me to the dollar, to the decimal point. My performance is completely exposed. And not just within my company, but to every client that we have. I cannot offload or blame or give credit elsewhere. And this kind of measuring is something that many people would hate, or at least prefer to avoid, because most people are very happy to hide in the crowd. There are not many people out there raising their hand and saying, "Judge me, and judge me objectively." The average job role is set up, intentionally or not, to be very difficult to determine direct contribution. Maybe it's more measurable from a team standpoint. You can determine the direct contribution of a team, but for the individual members, it's harder to actually pinpoint, to actually put a measurement to. But within that team, I guarantee you there is measuring going on. People know who the contributors are and who they aren't. But when results are objectively tracked, measured, and benchmarked, the value created becomes obvious. And the important thing is that you can see what you can continue to do well. You can determine what needs to be changed to get better results. And very importantly, the rewards from those results become easier to capture. It's hard to make the case that you should be able to capture more of the results if you cannot objectively measure and point to the results that have been created. And so along the lines of my encouragement to you, do everything that you can to put yourself in a position where your contribution is able to be seen and measured accurately, and then insist that you be compensated, judged, based on your objective performance. That takes guts, because it's exposing. You are literally asking people to judge you versus an objective benchmark. And that is incredibly motivating. It causes you to focus on the right things and to make sure that the results come in. And because of that, it can be incredibly rewarding. In a nutshell, we track and we measure so that we can observe reality, compare that reality to our intent, reallocate resources appropriately in order to get results, compare those results to an objective standard, and then repeat the process. People respond to incentives. The trajectory that we are on matters more than where we're at right now. We cannot build anything around a void. Measuring, tracking, and benchmarking gives us the pieces to create and respond to incentives, which shape our behavior. Systems, feedback, accountability, adjustment, growth. So, in the last bit of time together today, let's talk about application. Hopefully, you've been thinking about application of these concepts that we've been talking about as we've been going, applying them to your own life. It's easy for me to talk about things like health, fitness, money, career, relationships when it comes to benchmarking. And the reason that I do, by the way, is because if you crush it in those categories of life, specifically the 3 categories of health, relationships, and money, you're probably going to be getting pretty phenomenal returns in life. That is the reason that I focus so much on those examples. They also happen to encompass most of life. But the important thing when it comes to the whole process of benchmarking is that you are applying it to the things in your life that you care about, that matter to you. And that is the first step in terms of application. First, we need to identify what we care about. Remember what we said in the last episode. You don't need to track and measure very many things, just the things that you care about improving. Because you can only improve what you measure. Hey, look at that! I didn't say it as a double negative this time. And I can't tell you what those things are that are important, but the key thing is that it is something. Identify it. Focus on it. The next step, step number 2, is to actually track and measure. Even if you don't do anything else, start tracking and paying attention. Just the act of paying attention and tracking will adjust your focus and will start to adjust your behavior. That will happen whether you intend it to or not. But you did intend it to because you started tracking and measuring. Then, number 3, make sure that you focus on the right leading indicators and not just on the lagging indicators. Tracking the lagging indicators can be a good thing to do. As I talked about, I track my returns. I make sure that they are perfectly tracked and exactly accurate. But I keep in mind that those returns are the byproduct of the actual important things. And that is why I spend most of my time focused on the process outcome, not simply the price outcome. Identify and focus on the leading indicators: profitability, alignment, strategy. And the lagging results, price in this case, will follow. Step number 4 is to set an appropriate benchmark. It may be a peer group, it may be best in class, it may be a binary goal, or it may be yourself. And step number 5, draw that line between where you are, that you know based on your tracking and measuring, and what you are shooting for, the goal based on your appropriate benchmark. And what does that line give us? Yes, it gives us our trajectory. The most important thing. And then apply the steps needed to keep you going in that direction. If this sounds kind of like something we just recently talked about, it should. What we just described is not just the benchmarking process, it is the way that we set our direction and our process to achieve security. And I want to note this. We do not want to fall below our benchmarks, but we may not want to just match them either. Most of the time, we want to exceed them. I have benchmarks because I want an objective standard to beat, not just to meet. That may not be the same in every case, but a benchmark is not necessarily something that we are targeting to reach as an endpoint. Oftentimes, a benchmark is something that we are shooting to do better than, to reach and then exceed. In the case of financial returns, I'm looking to beat my benchmarks. And that line, our trajectory, reveals the path to doing that. And be honest about the appropriateness of that trajectory, that line, the steepness of that curve. If you make it too easy, what's the point? Nobody is going to be impressed that you moved so quickly along a flat line, least of all yourself. And if you make it too hard, you're kidding yourself. And no one will be surprised, and you shouldn't be either, that you can't climb a vertical wall from a very low point to an impossibly high point. Progress happens in that space of slight discomfort, with occasional failure, but mostly positive hit rates. So we want to set a benchmark that is appropriately challenging enough that we are failing sometimes. And if you're never failing your bar, your benchmark is probably too low, and your trajectory is going to reflect that. We should apply and repeat the benchmarking process for a very long time with the things that we are targeting results in. Maybe not forever, but it will probably be longer than you think in order to get real results. And there are some things, some benchmarks that are going to remain forever. But the food scale might go back in the drawer at some point. But now you know. You can't lie to yourself as easily about those spoonfuls of peanut butter. Your internal measuring tools have been calibrated, and now are more accurate based on accurate tools and measures that you used. The sets and reps notebook might get thrown out from tracking and measuring and benchmarking your workouts and your progress. But now you know about progressive overload and how to structure a proper workout, and then measure and benchmark those results. You may hang up your hat at the end of a career and have no more benchmarks to shoot for in terms of your professional work achievements, and that is okay. That can be a very good thing. But then set new benchmarks in life. Volunteering, relationships, mentoring, philanthropy. Because I'm sure we'll talk about in the future, those hard-charging, achievement-driven, high-drive individuals that accomplish a lot in their career and then get to retirement and determine that their goal is to do as little as possible, that doesn't translate into fulfillment and happiness in most of those cases. We don't have to do the same thing forever, but I do believe that we should do something forever. Okay, you have my permission to go out into the world and play the comparison game. But play it in the right way, with the right things that you're measuring for the right reasons, using the right benchmarks. Remember what I said in the last episode. I am not here to tell you to stop comparing. I'm here to tell you to stop comparing like a middle schooler and start comparing like a portfolio manager. The exercise of benchmarking, when properly done, will give you a standard to rise to for a purpose. And the ways and the things that we track and measure will give us the information that we need to do it. The comparison game, as it's usually applied, will steal your joy. But the proper benchmark gives direction and improves results, and can give joy. So let's do it better and on purpose for better outcomes. Okay, thank you for investing in yourself and in those around you. I will talk to you next time. My benchmark is Buffett. If I fall short in terms of returns, lifespan, or number of root beer floats consumed, it is a fail.